Welcome to On the Moneyline, a podcast by MMA Play 365. I'm Newsome, and I'm here to break down UFC San Antonio, which goes down this weekend, headlined by a phenomenal bantamweight fight between Marlon Vera and Cory Sandhagen. Just remember, though, that we are in Texas for this event. The Texas judges are notorious for producing some very questionable results when fights go to the scorecard, shall we say. So, obviously play with hesitation and just remember that we are in Texas. But just before we get started, as always, there's going to be a Base AI recap on our YouTube channel. So if you are listening to this on any of the podcast platforms, then the Base AI recap from last weekend at UFC 286 will be available on our YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/MMA Play 365. The straight pick prediction accuracy for that event was at 71%, so we'll break that down in a little bit more detail in that recap. But right now, let's get the breakdowns going. So we start in the main event, as I've already stated, the bantamweight division. At the top of the division, we've got Marlon Vera versus Cory Sandhagen. This is a phenomenal fight, and it was also a fight that had to be rescheduled as well because it was originally booked for the Apex, but, you know, I don't know whether the UFC just decided it was a bad idea or if they listened to the fans that were calling for this fight to be in front of a crowd, because that would have been devastating for this fight to be in the silence of the Apex. So they've got the fight in front of a crowd in Texas as a main event, 5 rounds, and I couldn't think of a better outlay for a fight like this. Now, into the breakdown of a fight, Marlon Vera is a really tough fighter to break down in regards to what you're actually going to get from him in the cage and then what result you're going to see at the end of the fight, because he's got this ability to just win fights when he's losing them. And you go back to this now for a number of fights. It started a little bit in the Frankie Edgar fight. Frankie Edgar was doing relatively well against Vera. Bear in mind, Frankie Edgar is at the end of his career. I'm not sure if he's retired actually or not. I can't remember. But, you know, Frankie Edgar was having some success against Vera, and then Vera finished him late. Then Vera goes in there against Rob Font, and this is the first fight in quite a while that I picked against Marlon Vera to win the fight, because I just thought Rob Font would just be able to beat him striking, keep the fight on the feet. And Marlon Vera, again, was losing the majority of the rounds and then really hurting Rob Font badly or dropping him towards the end of most of the rounds, and ended up winning the fight because of exactly what I've just explained, you know, losing the majority of the round, but then pulling out a big knockdown or just throwing an aggressive combination and hurting Rob Font badly, wobbling him, dazing him. But again, for the most part, Rob Font was doing some really good work. And then we go into the Dominic Cruz fight. Now, I bet Dominic Cruz. I think it was around a plus 200 betting line that I got on him. And I was banking on Dominic Cruz using his speed, using his movement, landing more strikes on Vera, and just hoping that Vera just doesn't land that one shot that knocks him out. And guess what? We go into that fight. Dominic Cruz is faster, he's more accurate, he's more efficient with his striking, he's actually quite aggressive as well, and I think that he throws Marlon Vera off quite a bit. And Vera, I'm not saying Vera wasn't doing anything, because he was, but Dominic Cruz was winning the fight until he wasn't winning the fight and Marlon Vera got the knockout. And this type of fighter that Marlon Vera is showing us is a bit of a blessing and a curse. It's a curse because you kind of, or in my opinion, I don't want to put money behind Marlon Vera because he's going to be more or less losing a fight until he wins it. But then, do I want to put money behind Marlon Vera because of the fact that no matter what happens in the fight, he's always live to finish the fight? And as a plus money underdog, it kind of is a little bit enticing when you look at the odds. It's a real weird one. Then moving on to Cory Sandhagen. Listen, Cory Sandhagen is one of the best fighters in the division. He has won only one in his last 3 fights, but the losses have come to a split decision against TJ Dillashaw, which a few people have, or a lot of people were saying was controversial. I personally just think it was a really close fight that could have gone either way. Then you've got the fight against Petr Yan. Petr Yan, you know, he is a beast regardless of what happened with Merab Dvalishvili in his last fight. You know, Merab's a completely different stylistic matchup to what Cory Sandhagen was. And Cory Sandhagen was doing a decent job against Yan. He just fell behind and started getting really teed off on late in the fight. And then, of course, he won his last fight against Song Yadong. Now, that fight against Song Yadong really impressed me because Cory Sandhagen, he mixed in his wrestling. He was aware that Song Yadong's main path to victory was keeping the fight standard and trying to land good combinations on Sandhagen to the body, to the head, potentially knocking him out. Sandhagen recognised that. So it's not like Sandhagen was a relentless wrestler, although at times it looked like it. Sandhagen was putting some strikes together, but he just had that wrestling game plan because he knew that was his path of least resistance, and I really like that. It shows a smart, educated fighter and a fighter that can follow a game plan as well. But this is my point here. I feel like Cory Sandhagen can just do it all. I feel like he's a quick mover. He's a bit unorthodox, a bit awkward to fight inside the cage. He's got good striking. He uses his boxing. He uses his kicks really well as well. But then he's got this wrestling side to him that we saw in his last fight where he can get fights down to the mat. He's got a decent jiu-jitsu game. Aljo exposed that a little bit, but listen, Aljamain Sterling's jiu-jitsu's at a very, very high level. He backpacked Sandhagen, and normally when Aljo backpacks you, you either get choked out or you can't change position. And that's exactly what happened with Sandhagen. So I feel like Sandhagen in this fight is going to be the more well-rounded fighter. I think he's going to be safer in most areas. I think that Marlon Vera to come out here and find a knockout against Sandhagen, it's just less likely to happen than what it is against a Dominic Cruz who's aging, against a Frankie Edgar that's aging, against a Rob Font that is super hittable, and he was getting robbled and rocked against Jose Aldo for the majority of their fight as well. So it's not as if Vera was the first person to do that to Font. I just think Sandhagen's more durable. I think he's more awkward to fight, harder to hit, and I'm just not sure that Marlon Vera is able to find that knockout. And the thing is, with this fight, I kind of feel it's going to follow a Marlon Vera type of fight where Cory Sandhagen is winning the rounds, he is winning the minutes, he is winning the fight. And people are then going to be thinking, okay, well, this is Marlon Vera. He's done this multiple times before. He's just going to find that knockout. And in this particular fight, I just don't think he finds that knockout that he has done in his previous fight. So for those reasons, I'm picking Cory Sandhagen to win this fight. And in the next fight, in the co-main event, we've got Holm versus Yana Santos. So for those that are a little unsure, Yana Santos is actually Yana Kunitskaya. I'm just assuming that she's married Thiago Santos since the last fight and has obviously taken his name. So an interesting fight. I kind of feel it might be a little bit actionless, maybe a little bit dull though. Both fighters, I do think, prefer that type of fight. Now, it is strange because they are both very similar fighters. So they actually both have decent striking, decent kicking games. I think Holm's boxing's much better though, but for the most part, they've both got a decent striking game. And they both like to use it, but I think they're actually both better when they're in close, in the clinch, tied up, trying to bully the opponents against the cage. And like I said, stylistically, I think they're both very similar. I just feel that Holm's the better fighter, and with two fighters that are similar, with one fighter seemingly a little bit better, a little bit stronger, it's normally that fighter that's going to have much more success. Now, the one thing that I will say is that loss that Holm had to Ketlen Verheide, which, by the way, I did score for Ketlen Verheide. I don't think it was a robbery. Could it have gone both ways? Either way, absolutely. But it wasn't a robbery or anything. It was a close fight. But that fight has aged like milk for Holm, because you look at Ketlen Verheide against Raquel Pennington in her last fight, and it was night and day compared to what we saw against Holm. So listen, maybe Verheide just had that once in a lifetime top performance that she's not going to be able to replicate. I do still think though that Holm has something to give. I know she's aging. I know that, like I said, that last fight hasn't aged very well for her, but I still think she's a good striker. I still think she's extremely strong and powerful for the division. Her physique is really, really strong. I do still think that she's going to be really strong and really effective in the clinch. I do actually think that she could score takedowns on Yana Santos as well. So I think Holm's just the better fighter wherever the fight goes. I still think she's got something left to give. Maybe not at the top of the division, but in these types of fights where it is a sort of top 10 fight and it is at the top end of the division, just not at the very top, I still think Holm's got something to give for those types of fights. So for that reason, I'm picking Holm to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Nate Landwehr versus Austin Lingo. Nate Landwehr should have been fighting Alex Caceres, Alex Bruce Leroy on this fight. Austin Lingo had obviously the fight with Ricardo Ramos a couple of weeks ago. But of course, Ramos missed weight by like 8 pounds or something. The fight got cancelled. You know, it's crazy that fighters are missing by that much. And the UFC have kindly matched up some nice violence for the fans in Nate Landwehr and Austin Lingo in this fight, or on this event, should I say. So, like I say, the fight's going to be violent. Both fighters love to get in there. Both fighters love to brawl. Both fighters can take damage, and both fighters like inflicting damage, which is going to be perfect for fans. And in that type of fight, genuinely, anything could happen. You know, I am more confident in one way in this fight, and that way is towards Nate Landwehr. But with that being said, would I be shocked if both of these fighters just start brawling in the middle of the cage in boxing range and just exchanging powerful hooks and powerful uppercuts and punches? If Austin Lingo was to knock Landwehr out, would I be surprised? Absolutely not. You know, it's definitely a possibility with how these fighters match up. And we always say, you know, styles make fights. And if Austin Lingo was a more technical fighter that likes fighting on the outside, then it'd be a completely different breakdown. And I probably wouldn't think that type of fighter would knock Landwehr out. But it's a possibility that Austin Lingo gets there. However, it's also a possibility that Nate Landwehr gets there as well. The thing is with Nate Landwehr, I also feel that he's the more likely fighter out of the two to mix things up should he want to. So should he want to start wrestling and grappling and take Austin Lingo down, I feel like he's going to be a better wrestler and a better grappler than Austin Lingo. If he can get Austin Lingo on his back, I think Nate Landwehr could do good work on top. And it's for that reason that I start to lean towards Landwehr because, like I say, they're both likely going to stand and strike in the middle, and therefore it's quite a relatively even fight. Both fighters have somewhat of some power to knock their opponent out. Both fighters are aggressive. Both fighters are durable. So, like I said, at this point, it's a relatively even fight. So then you have to look a little bit further. And like I've already said, I just feel that Nate Landwehr's wrestling and grappling is a little bit better than Austin Lingo's. And for that reason, I do feel like he's the more likely fighter to mix things up should he want to. Therefore, he gets that slight second path to victory. So for those reasons, I'm picking Nate Landwehr to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Andrea Lee versus Maycee Barber. Now, an interesting fight again. Like I said with Holm and Yana Santos earlier on, I feel like both of these fighters, in regards to the skill set, are both relatively well-rounded. I feel like they both fight in a similar way. They like to strike, they like to be aggressive, but then they can mix things up with a bit of wrestling and a bit of grappling. And I feel like in this fight, if Lee gets on top of Barber, I think Lee's going to be more effective on top of Barber than Barber on top of Lee. So I think Maycee Barber's got to be really careful of that. Not that she's going to be massively outmatched. I just think that Andrea Lee is probably going to be the better topside grappler out of the two. Now, in regards to the wrestling, I don't think the wrestling is that effective on either side. I feel like the defensive wrestling of either fighter is probably going to be better than the offensive wrestling of either fighter and could potentially nullify any takedowns, which then potentially nullifies that ground game a little bit. I do think it's a fight that's going to have the better action, the better moments, and the more moments on the feet striking. And that's where I'm favouring Maycee Barber, because Maycee Barber, for me, she's younger, she's hungry. And by the way, in regards to younger, she's 10 years younger. I didn't even realise Andrea Lee was 34 years old. So Andrea Lee's getting up there in regards to the age. I don't see an obvious decline. So I'm not saying that she's on a massive downfall and, losing a ton of fights. I don't think she's looked overly impressive in the last couple of fights, but I don't see obvious declines. However, there is a 10-year age gap between the two. So I feel like Maycee Barber's going to be younger, hungrier. I think she's going to be the quicker mover. I think she's got more power as well. Her combinations she puts together nicely. That adds up to a volume advantage also. So I think when you're looking at Barber versus Lee, I think it's going to be competitive in moments. I think we could potentially see a little bit of wrestling. Maybe there is a takedown somewhere. Maybe we do see a little bit of grappling as well. But I don't think that the wrestling and grappling moments will be enough and have enough effectiveness behind it to make the fight be won and lost on the mat grappling, whether that be a finish or whether that go to the judges' scorecards. I think that's definitely in the realm of striking. That's where I like Maycee Barber. I think she's got the physical attributes, she's got the age advantage as well, where she is going to be younger and have that youthful energy. And I just feel that Barber is on more of a roll right now. I think her form's a little bit better. I think she's finding herself finally inside the cage, and I think that Barber's going to put on a really good performance in front of the San Antonio crowd. The only one thing you've got to be careful of is if this fight does play out closely. Andrea Lee is from Texas, and like I said at the beginning in the introduction to this podcast, you just got to be careful in these fights where you've got a fighter fighting out of Texas with the Texas judges, just because they have been notorious over the years to be a little bit biased, it seems, and to produce some scorecards that they shouldn't be producing. So that's the one area to be careful of. But aside from that, look, stylistically, fighter versus fighter, I like Barber. So I'm picking Maycee Barber to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got a fun one, but also a very interesting one in the UFC flyweight division. We've got Alex Perez versus Manel Kape. And it's interesting because of Alex Perez. Now, listen, Alex Perez's career over the last couple of years has been an absolute mess. He was on a roll. He was on a ton of form. He was looking like a world beater, looking like a potential world champion. And he fought for that flyweight championship in 2020, which is 3 years ago now. I actually bet Alex Perez, I think he was better than plus 200. He might have been like plus 225 or something. But I bet Alex Perez against Deiveson Figueiredo, just given the odds. And I thought Alex Perez had a better chance of winning. Deiveson Figueiredo, obviously the best in the division at the time. He finished Alex Perez in the first round, caught that guillotine. I kind of wanted to see that fight play out a little bit more just because of the form Perez was on and how good he was looking. But since that fight, it's all been a mess. Alex Perez then had 6 cancelled fights over the next couple of years. Finally got a fight against Pantoja and lost the fight, was finished in that fight. Then since that fight, he had a further 2 cancelled fights, and now he gets Manel Kape. So it's a bit like, I'm just unsure, because Perez was looking great, but then he has almost 3 years off, having 1 fight in that 3 years, 8 cancelled fights in total for one reason or another, whether that's him having an illness, him missing weight, or the same on his opponent's side. It's just been so unfortunate for Alex Perez. And if this was Alex Perez straight after the Deiveson Figueiredo fight, or even before the Deiveson Figueiredo fight against this version of Manel Kape, I'd absolutely be taking Alex Perez here, and I'd be betting him as well. But I'm just not sure what we're going to see, because I thought that he was going to give Deiveson Figueiredo a much better fight. I thought he was going to give Pantoja a much better fight, and being finished in both of them in the manner that he was finished, you have got to consider that Pantoja and Deiveson Figueiredo, are top fighters in that division, or, Deiveson Figueiredo is moving up. So he was the champion. Pantoja's been, a staple of this division for a long time. He's also beaten Manel Kape as well. So I can't really talk too much bad about that and pick Kape because Perez lost to Pantoja, because Kape lost to Pantoja too. But looking at how this fight plays out, how the form of both fighters are coming into this fight, I picked against Manel Kape a lot. I bet against him quite a bit as well when he came into the UFC. I just wasn't convinced in the fights that stylistically he was fighting. But I do think he's slowly coming into his own here. He's always been a tough fighter. I've never picked or bet against him because I don't think he's good. I just picked and bet against him because I thought that his style played into the hands of his opponents. And I've actually got a pretty good record betting against Manel Kape. But I don't think that in this fight I can be that confident in Perez really taking it to Kape and beating him. And he might do, and it's a possibility, but he's an underdog for a reason, and that's because there's so many questions to ask about Perez. Having all that time off, having 8 cancelled fights, losing his last 2 fights in a row when he was on a roll. But it's not just losing those last 2 fights, it's also losing those last 2 fights and losing a big chunk of your career when you're in your prime. I'm just not sure how that affects Alex Perez moving forwards. He's not coming into this fight in any form. He's coming into this fight, seemingly not having many fights in the last 3 years. Whereas Manel Kape, he's been active. He's taken his losses in the UFC, but he's come back from those losses. He's now on a 3-fight win streak. He's now putting things together. He's now looking sharper, more confident. His jiu-jitsu's decent. Wrestling's decent. Striking is obviously really dangerous as well. So I actually think that from a skill set perspective, Alex Perez is the better fighter. I think Perez can match him in regards to the striking. I think Perez's wrestling is obviously really good. His topside jiu-jitsu is really good. But then I'm not saying that he can't take Manel Kape down. I think he can, but then I'm not sure how good of work he can do on top of Kape, or even can he get inside and find those entries into the takedowns with the striking and the danger of Kape. But I just don't know if Perez has lost a step or two over the last few years, being inactive, Obviously, his head's going to be a little bit down just because of the form, and then coupled with the inactivity as well. There's just so many red flags surrounding Alex Perez to the point where I'm really disappointed that I can't pick him to win this fight and I can't bet him to win this fight just because of everything surrounding his career. He's got every possibility of winning this fight. If this is the Alex Perez we see in the cage that we saw before the Davison-Figueiredo fight, I think he absolutely runs through Kape, and it would be a good betting line. But it's just, that was a long time ago, many injuries ago, many cancelled fights ago, and a couple of losses ago. So it's a real tough one, and it's a real shame, but I am picking Manel Kape to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Chidi, bang, bang, Chidi Njokuani versus the Russian Albert Duraev. And stylistically, we've got a clash of styles. So Chidi Njokuani predominantly is a striker. Duraev is predominantly a wrestler. However, Njokuani can also wrestle somewhat, but he's also a black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And Albert Duraev can also strike as the opposite to his predominant style. So we've actually got a really good fight here. Now, I do think that Duraev's going to have his moments in this fight, but I'm not sure his style is one that is going to dominate somebody like Njokuani. I actually think, even though Duraev's the wrestler, his path to victory in this fight is landing one of his big punches, one of his big overhands or his big hooks that lands clean on Njokuani and knocks him out. And although that is always a possibility, 4-ounce gloves, these are top fighters in the UFC, I just can't really give it a high likelihood of it happening. And I do think that Duraev is going to get outmatched striking from a volume perspective. I think Njokuani is going to have a massive height advantage, reach advantage. I think he's going to be a little bit of a faster mover as well. And from a technical perspective, Njokuani is the better technical striker. So I think Njokuani is just going to be landed on Duraev. Nothing too hard in the early moments, but I do think that he's going to land volume. That accumulation is just going to add up on Duraev to the point where either one of two things is going to happen. Either Duraev's going to start winging bombs back at Njokuani from miles away that Njokuani can see and avoid and evade, or Duraev's going to start really pursuing the wrestling, turning relentless. And I think, obviously, the first one, if he's winging bombs, I think on Njokuani, if he's a good enough striker to be able to see those strikes coming and avoid them. If the wrestling starts, then maybe he does take Njokuani down a couple of times. But Njokuani's got decent jiu-jitsu and a decent get-up game. I don't think where Njokuani fell short against Rodriguez in his last fight is the fact that Rodriguez was a world-class jiu-jitsu player as well, whereas Duraev doesn't have that jiu-jitsu. So Duraev's going to be relying on that top pressure game, but I think Njokuani will be able to stand back up. And if Duraev just keeps rinsing and repeating takedowns, I just don't believe he's got the cardio to be able to sustain that type of fight and that type of performance and constantly be taking Njokuani down. Then when Njokuani stands back up, taking him down again, I just don't think that Duraev's got the cardio or the gas tank to do that. So it's just one of these fights where it just really seems like a good stylistic matchup for Njokuani. He's also from Texas as well. He's also going to be inside, the Texas state with the Texas judges. Should it be a close fight and go to a decision, you would think that Njokuani would get the nod regardless. But regardless of what I think of the judges, I just do feel that Njokuani is going to be the better worker in this fight. I think that he is going to be able to keep the fight upright. The one concern is just make sure you just don't get hit by the bomb from Duraev. If he doesn't get hit by that bomb, I think he wins the fight relatively comfortably. And listen, even if Njokuani gets on top of Duraev, sweeps or reverses him with the jiu-jitsu, I think Duraev would be massively out of his depth underneath someone like Njokuani. So I do see multiple paths to victory as well. I'm picking Chidi Njokuani to win this fight. In the next fight, we've got Daniel Pineda versus Tucker Lutz. Now, Tucker Lutz is a fighter I was really high on when he came into the UFC. Obviously, he fought Pat Sabatini, which is never an easy fight, granted. But the way he got beat by Pat Sabatini was never in the fight, even though he had a very similar skill set. He struggled defensively, he struggled offensively, and it was just a really bad fight for Tucker Lutz. And it did make me think, have I sort of overrated his skill set and his qualities a little bit? But he is still a good fighter. He's got a good boxing. He's got a good takedown game. He's decent when he gets on top of his opponent as well. But Daniel Pineda has also got good boxing. He's also got a good takedown game. And he's also got decent jiu-jitsu once he gets on top of his opponent. So I feel like there's a lot of really well-matched fights on this card, and this is another one of them. Stylistically, they're both quite similar. I do think Tucker Lutz is probably going to be more, I think he's going to be hungry. I think he's going to be a little bit more dangerous. I think that he's probably going to lead the dance more often than not. But I just feel that Pineda is the more experienced fighter. I think he's been in there with the much better fighters. Sure, his form's not that great right now, but Pineda's a tough guy. He's going to be in the fight for as long as it lasts. It's going to take a big bomb to knock him out. It's going to take a real good fighter to completely control him. And all I'm saying is I feel like if Pineda comes into this fight and we see a little bit of wrestling from him, we see him take Tucker Lutz down, I just don't think this fight is as wide as what the betting is going to be, as one-sided as what the betting line suggests it's going to be. I think the betting line should be much closer, and I do think it's going to be a relatively close fight. And in these relatively close fights, I am more often than not going to side and pick the underdog. So for those reasons, I'm picking Daniel Pineda to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Steven Peterson versus Lucas Alexander. Now, fun fact about this fight, Steven Peterson in his UFC career has never closed as a favourite on the betting lines at the bookies. He is the favourite in this fight, around -170, -175. So there's a good chance this could be the first time that Steven Peterson is closing as a favourite in his UFC career. Quite wild, really, when you think about that. But Lucas Alexander, I kind of think there's some recency bias on this just because of the Brito fight. I'm not sure whether people will be overly impressed with what they've saw from Lucas Alexander outside of the UFC. But outside of the UFC, listen, you can only beat what's put in front of you, and that's what Lucas Alexander has been doing. And I don't think that he's a terrible fighter either. I think he's got qualities to him. He's training at Fusion XL with guys like Phil Rowe, with guys like Rodolfo Vieira, and they've got a real good team going at Fusion XL. They have had for a while now, actually, but Fusion XL is a really good gym for somebody like Lucas Alexander to really hone his skill set and develop as a fighter, because he is still relatively young. Whereas Steven Peterson, he's not as young, but he's a fighter that's fun. He's a fan favourite. He'll get in the face of his opponents. He'll make things ugly, dirty, gritty, grindy. He's durable. He'll eat 4 punches if it means landing one good punch himself. He's that type of fighter, the type of fighter we all love to see. But the thing is with Steven Peterson, I go back to the fact that I told you at the start of this particular breakdown. There's a reason why he's not closing as a favourite in his UFC career, and that's just because he is beatable. He does take a lot of damage. He's hittable. He does wear himself out the longer that fights go on because of the pace that's set in fights, and because of all this, because he's hittable, because he does slow down, because he is a fun, in-your-face type of fighter, it ultimately just means that he's very beatable. Now, Steven Peterson in this fight, where I think that he's going to have advantages is if he really gets into the wrestling and starts using his grappling. I think his grappling is actually the best side of his game. He just doesn't wrestle too often, and therefore doesn't get to put his grappling on show as much as he should. Like, you look at the Arota fight last time out, that fight was screaming for a takedown from Steven Peterson, but he just didn't. He wanted to stand and bang. And I think if you're standing and banging with someone like Lucas Alexander, who does have power, who is a quick mover, Alexander's got a Muay Thai style of fight, and his leg kicks are really solid, really hard, but he'll also switch stances and fire the left head kick to the head of his opponents, which he has hurt and knocked previous opponents out with. I do think that Lucas Alexander's technical ability on the feet is going to be better than Steven Peterson's. Lucas Alexander, if you go back and watch his previous fights outside the UFC, pretty much everybody he fights tries to take him down. There's a reason why they're trying to take him down, because he's that good of a striker, but also they're struggling to take him down. And I kind of feel like Lucas Alexander is a fighter that's learnt on the job with his wrestling defense, and just because so many fighters have tried to take him down, I think his wrestling defense has got pretty good. I don't think Steven Peterson is a good wrestler, but I don't think he's like a beast wrestler where he's just going to land takedowns at will. I think Alexander at the absolute minimum will make him work super hard for every takedown that he does shoot. But then Steven Peterson, if he doesn't get a couple of his takedowns, he will give up on them and then just stand and strike. I just don't think that Peterson should be this wide of a favourite in this fight. You know, similar to what I said with Pineda, I think the line should be much closer. And in a fight that I do think could be close, that I do think has got an improving young fighter like Lucas Alexander against a fighter like Peterson, who in my opinion I struggle to trust, especially when it comes from a betting perspective, I'm just going to side with that underdog in this type of fight. So for those reasons, I'm picking Lucas Alexander to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Trevin Giles versus Preston Parsons. And talking about fighters to trust and not to trust, and fighters that I've been impressed with and not been impressed with, we've got two fighters on the opposite scales here. We've got Trevin Giles, who, in my opinion, you know, I've not been massively impressed with Giles in his last few fights. I think when Giles first came to the UFC, he had this hype around him. It wasn't like super hype, but it was a fighter that I was looking at thinking, this guy's solid everywhere. He's got power, he's got decent wrestling, you know, his grappling seems to be okay. This is a fighter that's young and could really start making a name for himself in the UFC, but it just hasn't played out like that for Trevin Giles. But then on the flip side with Preston Parsons, he's a fighter that came into the UFC and I was a little bit unsure of at first. But you can't really put too much stock into that Daniel Rodriguez fight. You know, he took that on short notice. Rodriguez is freaking huge for the division as well. But Preston Parsons actually put it on Daniel Rodriguez in that fight. You know, he appreciated that obviously he was the better fighter, but still got in his face and took the fight to Daniel Rodriguez, who's an absolute beast. Got hit, hurt his eye, and that was the beginning of the end. However, it was an impressive performance nonetheless. Then he goes against Evan Elder. Evan Elder's obviously coming off that real good fight with Sadikov that he was winning. Evan Elder showed in that fight that he's a top fighter. A tough fighter, top fighter. We'll see where Evan Elder's career goes. It's obviously impossible to say that at this point in his career, but a good tough fighter nonetheless. Preston Parsons comes into that fight with Elder and he's hitting takedowns. And listen, I know Evan Elder, again, that was short notice for Elder and up a weight class as well, but Evan Elder, he didn't look undersized next to Parsons. And Evan Elder was also in a training camp for a 5-round title fight on the regional scene. So he came in prepared, and Preston Parsons landing takedowns, good grappling, submission attempts. He looked good striking as well, aggressive, sharp, clean, crisp. So a fighter that I looked at and thought, actually, Preston Parsons is looking okay here. And then it looked all right against Daniel Rodriguez, considering the situation. Then you look at Trevin Giles' last fight against Lewis Cosi. Now, no offense to Lewis Cosi, no disrespect intended, but Lewis Cosi is not one of the fighters that I'm super high on in the division. And it was literally a staring contest for the majority of the fight. Trevin Giles dropped down in weight again. I just don't know what his cardio or how much trust he has in the cardio and obviously in his ability to let his strikes go just in case he does tire out. I just don't know. It was just really not impressive from Trevin Giles, who just squeaked past a fighter in Cosi landing 35 strikes over 3 rounds. It's just super low volume. So when I'm looking at this fight, I'm thinking there's a chance, look, Trevin Giles can't look any worse than what he did in his last fight. So he has to be better, and I think he will be better. But I think Preston Parsons is a fighter that really believes in himself, a fighter that will take it to any fighter regardless of who they are, how big they are, the situation that the fight's presented itself in. And Parsons, well-rounded. I think he'll be able to land takedowns here. I'm not sure whether he'll be able to keep Giles down for too long. Giles' jiu-jitsu is really hit and miss. 1 minute he can look really good with a slick sweep or reversal, and then the next minute he's in a dominant position and then makes a mistake, loses that position, and then, finds himself on bottom potentially in mount. So I'm not sure how the grappling plays out here, but Preston Parsons, for me, I think his striking's okay, his volume's good, he's aggressive, he'll get in the face of his opponents. He'll do what Lewis Cosi didn't do and take it to Trevin Giles if there is some moments of inactivity in this fight. But then when you come to mixing things up with the takedown attempts and the jiu-jitsu, I just feel that Preston Parsons is going to be the more active fighter and just do more, and for that reason probably have more or multiple paths to victory. I don't think Trevin Giles is going to be able to take Parsons down and keep him down. I think Parsons is going to have the wrestling advantage, maybe a very slight grappling advantage in regards to the striking. I don't think Preston Parsons is the better technical striker, but he's the more active striker. The judges aren't scoring technique, they're scoring activity and volume. So, yeah, I'm leaning towards Preston Parsons in this fight. I am a little bit conscious of the fact that, like I've already said, Giles can't look any worse last time out. He's going to watch that fight and he's going to watch that last fight back and be very, very unhappy with himself and probably push himself to do more in this fight. And even like when you look at Giles when he fought against Duplessis, he was okay. If that's the Giles that we get against Parsons, Giles might end up winning the fight. But again, it's just it's tough to trust Trevin Giles after watching that last fight, and he's a fighter that has been known for a little deficiency in the fight IQ as well, which is never a good sign. So when putting all things together, I am siding with Parsons, so I'm picking Preston Parsons to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got CJ Vergara versus Daniel Da Silva. I'm quite surprised Daniel Da Silva's got another fight in the UFC, if I'm being honest, but make no mistake about it, if he loses this fight, he's going to be cut from the UFC. Fighters don't come into the UFC and go 0-4 and then have a fifth fight. So Daniel Da Silva's back is really against the wall in this fight, which is sometimes a fight you've got to be careful against, because when your back's against the wall and you've literally got nothing to lose, you've got to give everything. You've got everything to gain, because Daniel Da Silva knows he's going to be cut if he doesn't win this fight. So he's got to go and he's got to put the pressure on. He's got to try and do something serious. And that's always a dangerous fighter. But the thing is, Daniel Da Silva, he's had those 3 UFC fights against Jeff Molina, finished in round 2, Francisco Figueiredo, finished in round 1. Then he fought Victor Altamirano, finished in round 1. Although he did hurt Altamirano early in that fight, you can't come into the UFC, go 0-3 and lose all 3 fights by finish and then lose another fight. So I just don't think Daniel Da Silva is a fighter of UFC caliber, and I don't mean that disrespectfully. I think CJ Vergara is going to expose that as well. CJ Vergara is 1-2 in his 3 opening UFC fights, but the difference is he's fought Ode Osborne, he's fought Clayderson Rodriguez, and then he's fought Tatsuro Taira in his last fight. So this dude's had 3 real good fighters, so the fact that he's got a win out of those 3 is quite impressive. And I just think that he's going to be a level above Daniel Da Silva in this fight. When you look at the striking, CJ Vergara is a decent striker, he's a decent mover, he can take damage, but he can also put damage on his opponent, and he's also got good volume as well. Now, Daniel Da Silva, I think, is going to crash into the pocket for his best chance to get the better of Vergara's striking, but even crashing into the pocket, I think Vergara is going to be really fast with his combinations. He's got speed, he's got movement. If it does get a little bit too much for him, he could potentially level change and take Daniel Da Silva down. Vergara is likely the better wrestler. The better grappler, you might lean slightly over to Daniel Da Silva, but as a mixed martial artist, as an MMA fighter, CJ Vergara is just the better fighter, better skill set, better technique, better quality, speed, movement, good cardio. He's fought the better level of competition. He's got a win over someone like Clayderson Rodriguez. However you want to score that decision, it was a close fight and one that Vergara really put on him. So the level that Vergara's been fighting, I think the UFC have matched this up quite smart. They see Vergara as a fighter that just needs to build himself up a little bit, get a bit of confidence, get a little bit of form, and then Vergara could be a really fun fighter to watch moving forwards. Whereas Daniel Da Silva, I feel the UFC have seen how he's performed over his 3 fights. And look, Jeff Molina's not a bad loss, but looking at Francisco Figueiredo and then Victor Altamirano are fights where, could have been an argument for being 50-50 fights before going into it. And then, like I say, just being 0-3 and finishing all 3 fights. I think the UFC have matched this up very smartly. And it's in these types of fights that can, provide that bit of a shock should Daniel Da Silva win. But I think CJ Vergara is just a better fighter, plain and simply. Fought better level of competition, better skill set, and the more likely fighter to win in multiple ways. So for those reasons, I'm picking CJ Vergara to win this fight. In the next fight, we've got Manuel Torres versus Trey Ogden. Now, Trey Ogden upset, it seemed, quite a lot of people when he beat Daniel Zellhuber. Daniel Zellhuber was like a -250 favourite against Ogden, making his UFC debut. A ton of hype around Zellhuber. And Trey Ogden absolutely schooled him. Trey Ogden's predominant style is grappling, so he'll wrestle to grapple. Good wrestler as well. And he didn't really do too much of that against Zellhuber. He improved his striking. He was calm, composed, looked like a vet inside the cage, and really used his experience and his age and the knowledge that he has within the sport to just get by Zellhuber and beat Zellhuber in the one area that everyone thought that Zellhuber was going to have these huge advantages against him. So again, real impressive performance from Ogden, really opened a lot of people's eyes. And he comes into this fight as an underdog against Torres. And Torres, Look, you can argue this fight is very similar to that of the Zellhuber fight because Manuel Torres is that young fighter, that tall fighter, rangy fighter that's striking is his predominant style. Although he will wrestle and grapple more than what Zellhuber would, in theory, Manuel Torres is a striker. So there's a lot of similarities around this fight with Ogden compared to his last fight against Zellhuber, a fight that he won. Now, I feel like the difference being in this fight to the last fight is it was Zellhuber's debut. He did look a little bit gun-shy. He didn't let his strikes go. And I think Zellhuber will look back on that fight and be really disappointed with his performance because he didn't give the best that he could give. Whereas the big difference in this fight is where Zellhuber wasn't throwing strikes. I think Torres is not going to be that fighter. I think Torres will put combinations together. I think he's going to put volume together. I think he's going to hit Ogden and hurt him as well. Where this fight gets interesting is if Ogden can take Torres down. If Ogden can get the fight to the mat, I think Ogden's grappling is likely going to be on a different level to Torres. But again, I kind of feel like it's going to be one of these fights where Torres is going to defend the takedowns. He might get taken down once or twice, but quickly scramble back up to his feet. I don't think he's going to allow Ogden to take him down and then settle him on the mat as well. And it also strikes me as the type of fight where Ogden might have his best opportunities to score takedowns early in the fight, but then when the fight really gets going and Torres is putting these combinations together and lighting Ogden up on the feet, we start seeing some desperation takedowns that are being shot from slightly further away, and they're not going to be as successful because of that, and Torres is just going to get more and more comfortable throughout the fight the longer the fight goes on. I kind of feel like it's going to be that type of fight. I'd be shocked if Ogden comes in there, takes Torres down and subs him and gets him out of there early. I think Torres is going to be better with his get-up game. I think he's going to be better with his defensive wrestling, training at a good gym as well. So then you look at the striking, and I think Torres is going to do exactly what Zellhuber should have done. And if Zellhuber did do what he should have done, he would have likely won that fight. I think Torres is going to have that performance that Zellhuber should have had last time. For that reason, I'm picking Manuel Torres to win this fight. And in the next fight, this is going to be wild. We've got Vinicius Salvador versus Victor Altamirano. Now, I was quite high on Salvador when I just watched his last fight in the Contender Series, but considering where Shannon Ross has gone from there and how that fight played out, and you look at Salvador's regional fights, he's obviously improved from the regional scene, but there's a few things not to like about Salvador's game. He gets taken down very easily. If he does get taken down, he's held down, plays guard a lot, stays on his back, loses minutes of rounds. And I think if Victor Altamirano gets on top of him and Salvador does start playing guard, I think Altamirano will just stay on top of him, land some nice strikes, and just do exactly that. You cannot play guard like you play in the regional scene when you just come to the UFC. It ain't going to work out for you. So with that being said, though, both of these fighters have got an insane, wild striking game where it's hands down, where it's throwing big power strikes, big energy strikes, big movements, and just exciting the crowd. Vinicius Salvador's an absolute wild man. You know, go back and watch that fight with Shannon Ross. The dude is just throwing everything, hands down, throwing it from the hips, dropping him, rocking him, and that's Salvador's equalizer for his MMA game. For as much as he can be controlled and he can be taken down, the dude hits like a truck for a flyweight, and he drops and rocks pretty much everyone that he fights. Then you look at Victor Altamirano. I was thinking, well, Altamirano is going to be in a tough time if he holds back and stays on the outside. But Altamirano's not that type of fighter either. He also loves to come forward, throw big action strikes, look to land a big knockout as well. So I feel that both of these fighters are just going to absolutely crash into the pocket. I think they're going to be throwing wild strikes at each other. I think that Vinicius Salvador in that type of fight is going to land the knockout or the knockdown. You know, Victor Altamirano was knocked down by Daniel Da Silva. You know, with the things that I said about Daniel Da Silva, the fact that Altamirano was hurt by him early in that first round, I feel like if this is Vinicius Salvador, I think it's going to be a much different ending to the fight. However, if the fight does get out the first round, I think Altamirano will start to slowly take over, because I think he'll start mixing in some wrestling. I think he could get Salvador down, and that's if the fight goes late. I kind of feel it's going to be a crazy round one with a potential finish. If there's no finish, I think it's going to be a bit more of an even round two. And then if it goes into round three, I think Altamirano is going to have the better chance in that round three. So I actually think the fight's going to end it. I just think they're both going to be crazy unless Altamirano's got a wrestling heavy game plan, which he might have, but I can't make that assumption. I'm just going from what I've seen in tape, and I think Vinicius Salvador does find that home to finish Altamirano, so I'm picking Vinicius Salvador to win this fight. And in the final breakdown of this podcast, a fight that got added only a few days ago, actually, we've got Tamires Vidal versus Hayley Cowan. Hayley Cowan's supposed to have fought again just a couple of weeks ago, but it was actually her that pulled out with illness after the weigh-in, so weird that she's coming back a couple of weeks later and not her opponent, Aylin Perez. And weirdly, talking about Aylin Perez as well, Tamires Vidal has got a win over Aylin Perez by illegal knees. You know, you go back and watch that fight, Aylin Perez was doing well. Unfortunately, you know, the fight was lost due to those illegal knees. So, in the UFC debut of Vidal, she looked really impressive. She got the finish. She looked good. She looked strong. She looked powerful. The striking was there. She does look to have more of a striking background. However, she is relatively well-rounded as well, whereas Hayley Cowan looks to like to get close in the clinch, get her opponents down, look to do good work on top. And the thing is with Cowan, she's more often than not the taller, longer fighter, and she's going to be in this fight, not by a big margin, but taller and longer nonetheless. She doesn't really use her reach or range very well. Like I say, she likes to get close into the distance. She's got that type of deceptive strength, I think, inside the clinch as well. So I think it's going to be a really well-matched and really close fight, this, between two fighters that should be able to handle themselves wherever the fight goes. But when you're looking at the slight edges, I just feel if Cowan is the fighter that is closing the distance, getting in the clinch, running some minutes down on the clock, potentially landing a takedown and having a little bit of top control time, even if it might not be too much top control time, just top control time nonetheless, and then it being relatively even on the feet. I think in that type of fight, you then got to start giving some edges to Cowan very slightly. Again, should the fight go to a decision and the striking's very close, they're going to be looking at who's done that extra little bit of work elsewhere to potentially separate themselves and win the fight. I do think Vidal's going to be the slightly more dangerous striker, but I don't think she's going to knock Cowan out. I mean, you can never say never, but I just don't see it being like it went last time for Vidal. I think Cowan's going to be tougher, a better striker, and just be able to work Vidal on the feet too, whereas that wasn't the case in Vidal's last fight. So it's going to be a close fight, but considering the points that I've mentioned and the mixing things up and the grinding and the potential takedowns, I am going to be siding with Cowan, so I'm picking Hayley Cowan to win this fight. And that's all for this episode of the podcast. I hope you've all enjoyed it. As always, we appreciate every sub to the YouTube channel. We appreciate every download to the podcast platforms. And also, if you are on YouTube, you are replying or putting comments, it is me that replies to the comments. So if you want to drop a comment, tell me who you're betting on, tell me who you like for this event, and tell me who you've been screwed by the Texas judges in previous Texas events, as well as a little bit of fun. We can go there as well. But like I said, that's all for today. I'm Newsome. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again in a couple of weeks after the 1 week break that we've got next week.